Lesson 12, 1863, Western Theater. What we're looking at here is the Siege of Vicksburg. This is the turning point of the West in the American Civil War, because by the end of this battle, the Union will have control of the Mississippi River. So let's take a look at where we left off. We talked about the decisive and really one of the major battles of '62 in both theater of war, but especially the West, and that is the Battle of Shiloh. Remember, named for the small church near Pittsburgh Landing on the border of Tennessee and Mississippi. The Confederates on the first day of the battle pushed Grant and Sherman to Pittsburgh Landing, but they were reinforced by Don Carlos Buell, and they pushed the Confederates back. Remember, the Confederates had a pretty brutal loss on that first day in the Hornets' Nest, the death of Albert Sidney Johnston. Beauregard takes command of the army, and he will fall back in retreat to Corinth, Mississippi, and ultimately Corinth will be taken by the Union as well. Remember that old brains, Henry Halleck, he hates Grant for a number of reasons. Grant's past, bit checkered. He's also not in the mind of Halleck, not at the level of the intellect and prestige that he should be to be in command of an army, and Halleck wants him removed from command. Rumors are being spread that Grant's turned back to the bottle, which is not true. In fact, in any of these successes, when the guys would pour, tip back some whiskey or wine or whatever, Grant would refuse to drink. He would only gnaw on a cigar. Grant smoked about 20 cigars a day. Yeah, it's pretty hardcore. So, yes, he did. That is, yeah. The cigars ultimately take Grant's life in the end. So Lincoln will not remove him from command. Actually, to sort of quell the drama, so to speak, Lincoln pulls Halleck to the east as basically like what we would consider today a chief of staff. So he called Halleck, a first-rate clerk, because Halleck was better at sort of tactics and strategy as opposed to being in the field, and he couldn't give Grant up because Grant was winning battles. He was winning decisive battles. Remember that in April, David Farragut will move up the Mississippi. New Orleans will fall. Remember, the Beast, Butler, will take control of New Orleans. We talked about how the women of New Orleans started printing the face of Benjamin Butler in their chamber pots. So, get it? The Beast. Decisive victory in Kentucky. We talked about this before. This is like Buell's. The crowning achievement for Don Carlos Buell was reinforcing Grant and Shiloh and defeating Bragg at Perryville. In fact, it's kind of remarkable that Bragg maintained command following this battle. Remember, they're going to have to retreat out of Kentucky. And we talked about how Breckinridge, who was a Kentuckian, called his brigade the Orphan Brigade because they couldn't return back. This is really, Kentucky's now lost to the Confederacy as a result. And then we talked about another decisive victory for the Union, the Battle of Stones River, or the Second Battle of Murfreesboro. It's outside of Nashville. This is really a horrific battle. And if you look at the numbers, Shiloh and Stones River, or Second Murfreesboro, they're just brutal losses in the West. But the thing about Murfreesboro was this is the most the highest casualties per capita of people fighting in the war of any other battle in the war. So it's a major Union victory. But really what's difficult here is that Rosecrans, who is in command, is really going to, because Buell's replaced for moving slow to follow up on victory in Kentucky. Rosecrans is slow to follow up on victory at Stones River. They call the earthwork fortifications in and around Murfreesboro, they name it after Rosecrans because they're just kind of dug in. So here we have Farragut's capture of New Orleans. We have the Union victory here at Stones River, outside of Murfreesboro. See the Stones River in the distance. So now let's move to the siege of Vicksburg. Why is Vicksburg, Mississippi so important? It is the Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Grant wanted to continue down the Mississippi, but he had failed attempts in the fall of '62. These are small battles and skirmishes: the Battle of Chickasaw Bluff, the Yazoo River Pass expedition, Steele's Bayou expedition. So they actually end up pulling a play out of John Pope's playbook in which he attacked Island Number 10, and they are going to launch a siege from the east, and they're going to capture Jackson. Why is capturing Jackson, Mississippi going to be important? What is Jackson, Mississippi? It's a capital. Very good. Well done. All right, so here we have, see this real significant bend in the river on the Mississippi? That is what allowed for the Confederate fortification of the city. So Union gunboats focused on the Confederate battery at Port Hudson, Louisiana, but Union forces really were held from taking control of Port Hudson, south of Vicksburg. These attacks were launched from New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Farragut and Union forces had taken these cities. Baton Rouge lies just west of New Orleans. It's not that far outside of New Orleans. Naval support comes from Rear Admiral David Porter's fleet north of Vicksburg, ran past the Vicksburg batteries to get to the south of the city, and ferried troops to the east bank. So what we're looking at is a full encircled siege that is being planned, and the base of operations is really going to essentially be Grant launching this attack from Jackson after Jackson falls into Union hands on May 14th, 1863. This also divided Joseph E. Johnston from Vicksburg, and it prevented Confederate commander John C. Pemberton from being reinforced. Pemberton is a pretty interesting figure in the war. He is a Pennsylvanian. He decides to go with the Confederacy because his wife is a Southerner. She is from Norfolk, Virginia. And Pemberton will be one of a rare general that was Northern by birth and decided to fight for the Confederacy. So Pemberton's going to retreat west towards Vicksburg. He does attempt two offensive assaults at Champion Hill and Big Black River Bridge, but neither assault was successful for Pemberton. Here we have John C. Pemberton. I included for you guys attached to the lesson, I'd like for you to take a look at this. This is a really cool, crazy artifact that was just found several years ago. It's a cipher in a bottle, a little tiny medicine bottle. And this cipher was sent from Confederate forces to Pemberton, and in the cipher once it's transcribed, which was just transcribed not long ago, they're basically saying to Pemberton, sorry, we can't get your reinforcements. You're going to have to dig into Vicksburg. So if you get an opportunity, check that out. There's a really cool article about the cipher. It's located at the Civil War Museum in Richmond, near the White House of the Confederacy. They've got it down there. I think it was donated. So the Union makes several assaults against Confederate defenses. The Confederate line is about 18,500, but Grant has twice the number. So on May 19th, Sherman's corps lost just under 1,000 men on a frontal assault with no proper reconnaissance. Another attack was launched on May 21st. The Confederates were bombarded for 4 hours. Union infantry attacked along a 3-mile front, broke through a few times, but were eventually beaten back. Grant ordered diversionary attacks, first by Sherman and then by McPherson. Both of those were repulsed, and it led to over 3,000 Union casualties in these initial assaults on Vicksburg. What I've provided here for you is a map. This will show you the troop movements in establishing the siege, and you can see where the siege begins from Jackson moving in, and then the siege lines will be set up in and around. So the blue line, May to July, is the siege lines of the Union, and then that's the Confederate defensive where Pemberton and his men are dug in. And, well, let's see. Can everybody take a look here? See that real drastic bend? That is what allowed, I mean, there's Confederate defenses all along. So this drastic, dramatic bend is what kept Vicksburg fortified. And it's obviously not impregnable because they're going to break through and take the city. All right, so in June, Grant's troops dig in and start the siege. So what does this look like to you on the top right? What's being dug here? Trenches, yes. The use of trench warfare, right? We know that Grant's done this before, but now where we really start to see the use of trench warfare in the west is Vicksburg. We're going to see the use of trench warfare in the east around Petersburg. So we're going to talk about that in our next lesson. So everyone, soldiers, civilians, are trapped in the city. They're separated from the rest of the Confederate Army. On June 7th, they attempt to cut through Grant's supply line at Milken's Bend, which I pointed to just a second ago, to the northwest. But Grant had plenty of supplies in all directions, and the people of Vicksburg didn't. They run out of food. They start eating dogs, horses, skinned rats were hanging in butcher shops. It was brutal. Constant shelling drove the residents to moving inside the hills, and they started calling it Prairie Dog Town because the people were living in the hills, and they like dug out in the clay rooms, laid out rugs, had furniture. They tried to make the most of it. So Davis wants Joe Johnston to move to break the siege line. Johnston resisted, and he tries to pull forces together near Jackson, Mississippi, but by the time this takes place, all is, for the most part, lost because Vicksburg is under siege, running out of supply, and it's ultimately going to lead to surrender. Davis suggested Lee try to break it, but we already know where Lee is, right? Where's Lee at this period of time? We're close to being where? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Gettysburg. Good. He's moving on Gettysburg. Lee has got a northern invasion. So this is actually kind of working out for Davis because he feels like that might pull the Union soldiers away from the west. But we also know that Grant has a dogged pursuit here, and he is going to take the city. There is a reason that the surrender occurs on July 4th. Any ideas? Why would Pemberton surrender to Grant on July 4th? Help me out. It's Independence Day. He feels like he'll get a more conditional surrender, but oh, wait a minute. Grant doesn't give conditional surrenders. That's his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. So he thought, what's that? Yeah, Unconditional Surrender Grant. So, yeah. Get it? U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Unconditional Surrender Grant. So, of course, Pemberton is captured and taken as a POW, and there is no conditional surrender. The city falls in the hands of the Union. Just 4 days later, Port Hudson will be captured, and now the Union controls the entire Mississippi River. So you can imagine what the Confederacy is going through. Within a 4-day period, they have lost Gettysburg and Vicksburg. These two battles are the turning points of the war. And I think if you've been with me in the past, I've talked about how you have to almost just talk about both of these battles together, because it is a crushing blow. Even though this war is going to last well over another year, this is a crushing blow for the Confederacy. To lose the river and to have to abandon the northern invasion within a 4-day, in less than a week. So, I've got a map here that shows you this bend in the Mississippi at DeSoto Peninsula. Get it? DeSoto, remember, he's the first European to explore the Mississippi River. We see Pemberton's defense lines. We see Grant's siege lines all around the city. All right, let's move on to Chickamauga. This is the great victory for the Confederacy in the West, but they don't really act on this particular victory. Before I move on with Chickamauga, I did want to mention one thing that you guys may have heard before. I thought I would add. After the fall of Vicksburg, the people of Vicksburg didn't celebrate Independence Day for another 80 years because they had surrendered on the 4th of July. That's some lost cause material right there. All right, so let's talk about Chickamauga. Braxton Bragg and Rosecrans sparred off for 6 months in what you already know is the Tullahoma campaign. This is the campaign that was fought on basically the border of Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, from essentially the end of Stones River, the Battle of Stones River, all the way to the summer of '63. The Union wants control of Chattanooga. Chattanooga opens up the gates to Atlanta and to the railheads and production of the American South, right? Like if you think about real wartime production, you think Richmond and you think Atlanta, all right? So, Rosecrans has superior numbers, Bragg has superior cavalry, Joe Wheeler, Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, they are just running interference. They're actually running raids as far north as Ohio to try to cause, absolute chaos for the Union behind enemy lines. So Bragg falls back after the loss at Stones River. The Tullahoma campaign is fought, as I said before, on that southern border of Tennessee, northern border of Alabama, northern border of Georgia, that whole area. And then that's another reason why I encourage you to read an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge paired with this lesson. That's an idea of the period of time where that short story would have been based upon around this era of the Tullahoma campaign. So this is the Tullahoma campaign. So we've got fighting all the way down, pushing toward Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia border. And ultimately, this is the prize that the Union has its eye on, the city of Chattanooga. It's obviously got, look, railheads, the Tennessee flowing through it. So keep in mind a couple of areas here. We have Lookout Mountain, we have Missionary Ridge, and just to the south is going to be Chickamauga. So why is Chattanooga important? It sits in the Cumberland Gap, Cumberland Mountains, at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee River and the junction of two Confederate east-west railways, major route to Atlanta. So Rosecrans has outmaneuvered Bragg, launching a direct attack on the city. Bragg moves his forces south of the Tennessee, just below the city, and abandons Chattanooga on September 9th, 1863. Concentrates the forces south of the city, was reinforced by Joseph E. Johnston, and then sent from the east is Longstreet and John Bell Hood. Gettysburg was over and the Army of Northern Virginia had been divided into 3 corps, so Longstreet and the 1st Corps head to reinforce. So, let's take a look at the map. We have Murfreesboro. We have Knoxville. We have Chattanooga. We have Atlanta. So, do we have a good understanding of why this particular city and this particular campaign is important? Chattanooga opens up the opportunity to take Atlanta. But what it ultimately does is it's going to give William T. Sherman his opportunity to later on to lead the march to Atlanta and ultimately the march to the city. So here's the troop movements from Murfreesboro to Chickamauga. Here we have the Tullahoma campaign, Confederate movement and Union movement to Chattanooga, Union movement toward Chickamauga, and then let's talk a little bit about Chickamauga. So, Rosecrans has superior numbers, his 3 corps, but what happens by mistake is he is reported from a scout that there's a hole in their line, in their defensive line. So they try to correct the gap in the line. In reality, the scout saw the wrong thing. There was not a gap in the line. So by correcting it, they made a gap, and Longstreet exposed it, and it was a near rout. If not for George Thomas we talked about him earlier in the semester. He's the guy from Southampton County, Virginia. He and his family survived the Nat Turner Rebellion. He goes on to West Point, but he's one of the few Virginians, decorated Virginians, that refuses to secede with Virginia and the Confederacy and stays loyal to the Union. He holds the gap in the line and prevents a rout and quite possibly the destruction of Rosecrans' army. That is why he is called the Rock of Chickamauga. Rosecrans was baffled by the Confederate victory here. Lincoln said that he looked like, or he appeared to be a duck that was hit on the head. Lincoln removes Rosecrans from command, and Thomas will gain command. But this is also a pivotal moment because this is where Grant gains command of everything in the West. as a result of Chickamauga. So, Rosecrans' army falls back to Chattanooga, and the Confederacy gets really the most significant victory that they've had to date in the West. I know everyone's been paying attention. Everything we've talked about in the West has been Union victory, Union victory, Union victory. This is a pivotal moment, though, because Bragg, as a result of this battle, has lost over 20% of his army. All right? Those are pretty high casualties. So he's slow to act. This is where Longstreet and other Confederate officers are demanding that Bragg be removed from command because he's not following up on this victory. Bragg will stay in command. Remember, Jefferson Davis and Bragg are close friends, but it will ultimately lead to his resignation by the time we're done with this lesson, because not only is he not going to follow up on the attack, but his army is going to be routed in the Battle of Chattanooga and the Battle of both Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, just south of Chattanooga. So, Rosecrans, General George Thomas, Southampton County native, becomes known as the Rock of Chickamauga. Take note of that, the Rock of Chickamauga. And he replaces Rosecrans. I talked about the casualties. These are significant casualties. Almost 15,000 wounded Confederates. One of those that were wounded in this particular battle that was nearly devastating for the Confederacy was John Bell Hood. He had to have a leg amputated as a result of the battle. Davis goes down during the parade to Davis visiting Bragg's headquarters. The soldiers start heckling Davis for food. Feed us. You're saying, feed us, Master Davis. Feed us, Master Jeff. That didn't really go over too well with Jefferson Davis. In October, Lincoln made Grant commander of the entire Western Theater. The newly formed Army of the Cumberland went under the command of Rosecrans was removed, and Thomas now gained control. So here we have Chickamauga, just south of Chattanooga. All right, so let's talk about Chattanooga to wrap up 63. Confederates had trapped the Union in the city. They had a 6-mile line force of infantry along Missionary Ridge. They had artillery atop Lookout Mountain, and they covered all approaches from the west, and they could strike the Union supply as well. Couple of problems here. Has anybody been to Chattanooga before? Nobody? All right. One problem in particular that they did not account for, there's two problems. The guys on Lookout Mountain had contour maps, not military maps. So the way that they positioned their cannon was a little off. All right. Another problem was on Missionary Ridge. Different infantry units on Missionary Ridge got different orders. Some guys got orders to hold the mountain. Some guys got orders to, if there was an assault on the mountain, to retreat. So that leads to problems in this particular campaign as well. Not to mention the fact that there was a lot of infighting going on in the Confederacy, because you would have thought they would have come out of Chickamauga with high spirits, but they come out of Chickamauga very divisive over the fact that Bragg's still in command. Joe Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest are hitting Union supply lines. Union Army of the Cumberland was slowly starving within Chattanooga. So here we have the Chattanooga campaign. But do keep in mind that George Thomas and Grant are about to be reinforced in the largest reinforcement effort in the entire Civil War, and the largest reinforcement military effort in warfare until the 20th century. And is going to be led by none other than good old Fighting Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker gets command of 2 of the corps of the Army of the Potomac and reinforces Thomas by rail. They move these guys through the Appalachian Mountains by rail. Reinforcements of 20,000. The problem, though, is that the guys in Chattanooga are starving, so they need more food. So a supply line to get food to soldiers is going to be established as well, and it's out of range of lookout and the cavalry screens that are being run by both Forrest and Wheeler. Sherman was sent to hit Bragg's right flank. Joe Hooker was sent to hit Bragg's left flank. George Thomas was to hold the Union center. But here's what's very interesting. So if you take a look here, we have Lookout Mountain, we have Missionary Ridge, we have the city of Chattanooga. The assault begins on Lookout Mountain on November 24th. It's called the Battle Above the Clouds. Hooker is going to launch an attack to take the Confederate artillery. You would think that the artillery would be able to fire down upon the men, but due to the wrong specs, they actually fired above the men's heads, and the Confederates were forced to retreat down Lookout Mountain. The next day, without Thomas's orders, was actually led by Philip Sheridan. Philip Sheridan, the Michigan-born West Pointer that had the cavalry regiment. He looks up the top of Missionary Ridge. He sees these infantry units. He pulls out a flask. He toasts to them, takes a swig of whiskey. A couple of shots are fired down at him. And he said, you're going to pay for that. I'm going to take this ridge today. He did it without any orders. So Grant and Thomas are standing there, and Grant's like, who in the hell ordered him or these guys to go to the top? And he's like, honestly, I didn't. But when these guys get going, you can't stop them. And Grant said, if this doesn't turn out right, there's going to be hell to pay. Well, it turned out well. The Confederates could not believe their eyes. They couldn't believe that Sheridan and the Union were taking the mountain. This goes back to the conflicting orders. Some fired and then had received an order to fire down upon and retreat. In this chaos, those who were commanded to hold the mountain ended up retreating with these men as well. And by the end of the 25th, Union flags are flying atop both Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. And by the 26th, Bragg is pretty much tendering his resignation. So, reluctantly, Davis is going to put Joseph E. Johnston in command. Remember, Davis and Bragg were close friends. Davis hated Joe Johnston. So putting Johnston back in command was like a dagger to Jeff Davis. So what we've got here is a pretty significant casualty report in these two battles, but there is a tactical advantage here. The Confederates are ultimately going to fall back toward Atlanta, and Sherman is now going to have the opportunity to launch what will become the March to the Sea. Sherman gains command in the west, and now we're going to see Grant in 64 move to the east to take command of the Army of the Potomac. Oh, by the way, do keep in mind, by 64, Lee is in command of all Confederate armies, and Grant is in command of all Union forces. So we're now setting the stage for 64.
That's just wild. He just took a shot and took him out.
Yeah, a couple of shots. He said, all right, I'm going to go ahead and take the mountain now. I can't remember how he put it. He said, well, that was disingenuous, or, well, that, he didn't say that was rude, but, well, that wasn't polite. Just drink the whiskey. We'll be taking the mountain then. So This is the area of Chickamauga on the Tennessee-Georgia border. Chattanooga here to the north. I know that I'm like, I probably go overboard on the maps, but I think it's important. This is the battle above the clouds at Lookout Mountain. Did I already ask, has anybody been to Chattanooga before? Nobody? All right. Gotta hike to the top of Lookout Mountain. Anybody ever been to Atlanta? Yeah? Ever hiked to the top of Stone Mountain? Do it. Wow. All right. So let's look at some political impacts here. This is where we're going to pump the brakes. Confederate losses greatly damaged international recognition in '63. Confederate ironclad ship purchases from England were stalled. Democratic gubernatorial races were impacted. Crushing blow to the Copperhead movement. Clement Vallandigham and others that were trying to run in governor's races. So all these Republican governors are elected. France invaded Mexico City, but stalled on intervention in the Civil War as Union forces under General Nathaniel Banks launched a successful campaign into Texas, which we'll call that the Trans-Mississippian Theater as we move into '64. And then we have Lincoln and Andrew Johnson running against George B. McClellan and George H. Pendleton on the Democratic ticket. They squared off in the presidential election of 1864, and Lincoln is going to win re-election. So we got really cool political cartoon of little Mac trying to get in between Jefferson Davis and Lincoln, tearing the country apart. And then this is the political map for 1864. Clearly you see Lincoln won in an electoral college landslide, and he did pretty well in the popular vote as well. A student once asked me, seems like the voter turnout was kind of low. Not all states allow their soldiers to vote absentee. That's pretty messed up. So one state in particular was the state of Pennsylvania. So that's kind of like a weird factor that could have really impacted this election, and it kind of did in a way. All right.